before I begin, just want to give a disclaimer here. We're going to be going through multiple decades, and this is going to focus on the console industry specifically. So there's tons of history with this. If you find any of it interesting, I would definitely suggest going into it. The arcade history itself and computers in general are all, I mean, at least to me, super interesting, but as we're in theory all nerds here, I assume there's at least one other person that might be interested. So with that, I'm going to start at the beginning. So the thing with video games in general is that a lot of it began on computer systems, and they were meant not as entertainment or anything super interesting, but to show off what the computers could do or to be built to advertise to people. So starting in 1950, we have one of the very first recorded systems with Birdie the Brain, and then we have OXO from 1952 as well. They were both systems built specifically for playing tic-tac-toe. And with that, and the specifics of their systems, they were actually dismantled afterwards, unfortunately. So we don't really have a lot of that super early history regarding these. After those two, in 1958, we moved to Tennis for Two, which is often regarded as the first of the official quote-unquote video games that were made. There's a really intense debate over these topics, but the interesting thing about Tennis for Two, it's the first one we have on record really for being made specifically to entertain people. And then we skip a little bit forward to 1960s with Space War, created by Harvard and MIT employees Martin Grates, Steve Russell, and Wayne Weetanen in 1961 to 1962. It was written for the PDP-1 computer. Also an important kind of fact there is the transition to writing for computers and systems that already existed rather than building from scratch or putting components together to create this machine. They built it with 3 goals in mind. They wanted to use all of the available computer resources. They wanted to make all of the runs interesting and diverse so that it would be unique. And 3, they wanted to make it be fun so that it could count as a game. Now, I can't officially state if all 3 goals were successful, considering the future of Space War. I would say they were. The first one, however, was so successful that this game was meant to be a single player versus the computer in a dogfight space war in an asteroid belt shooting at each other. But the computer did not have enough processing power left over to handle a second ship, so it is now a 2-player game. Now, there were only 55 of these specific computers it was built for that sold. The computer cost about $120,000 in 1960s, so not exactly accessible for everyone. And most of them, as the history was that they were in research facilities or universities, places that could afford that and were specifically trying to press the boundaries of what computers could do and inventions and things like that. And through Steve Russell's words, saying that the greatest achievement was inspiring others. What I was most pleased with was that a number of people saw Space War and went off and said, I could do that, and then implemented their own versions on another system without looking at the source code. Now we're going to skip forward to 1970s with the arcade scene. So before this, arcades existed, obviously, but were much more focused on electromechanical games, so think like pinball or like whack-a-mole games like that. But in the 1970s, some of the very first arcade cabinets for video games started showing up, the first one being Space War clones. So the thing with that is there were actually 2 specific major ones during this time, but the one we want to focus on was created by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. While it was successful, the 2 thought it could sell better, they could do better with it, and then decided to found Atari Inc. A very important name, keep that one in mind. So in 1972, Pong was released and was the first of the major arcade cabinets to take on the scene. And with selling over 8,000 cabinets in 2 years, showed that there was a huge market, super successful, and led to the golden age of the arcade. Also Also, in 1972, Ralph H. Baer released the Magnavox Odyssey. It was marketed as the new electronic game of the future. He originally had the idea back in 1951, but as you can see from Birdie the Brain and OXO, we weren't exactly there yet in technology. It cost about $730 today, had 28 games, did not have tic-tac-toe, but it did come with a bunch of different accessories. So the console itself could only really keep track of pixels on the screen, and the pixels that were there were really rudimentary. So a lot of the rules and scorekeeping were up to the people playing, which, as somebody who grew up with siblings, I cannot imagine led to any arguments whatsoever. But one of my favorite things you can kind of see on here with these two images is that because it could only do really basic pixel content, they gave you these sheets that you would then tape over top of the TV screen to make it more immersive, and then you could actually see what game you were playing. This one sold about 350,000 units for about 3 years, and it inspired the clone in Spain, which became possibly the first console developed in Europe. With that, one of the very first games, one of the major selling points was a tennis game, which in 1975, Pong actually created a home console version of Pong called Pong. But with their tennis, they got into a ton of lawsuits with anybody else who wanted any form of a tennis game, and including some of the other ones, which lasted for a long time. I'm not going to get super into that, but I feel like it's important. And then we have a couple more photos here, just showing off the console, a couple more of the accessories, the game cartridges, which are really interesting and almost look like little sticks of RAM that you would shove in, and the controller, which looks very different from modern controllers, as those little knobs on the sides of the white box are actually little dials that you would turn and use to move. So from there, we move into late 70s and going into the 80s. The Fairchild Channel F released and was the first one to use what you would more think of as your typical game cartridge. So think like the plastic that you would then put into the machine. And it was pretty successful, worked really well, so it basically became an industry standard from there. And also in 1976, Warner Communications purchases Atari. This will also be important. 1977, there were so many clones of Magnavox and Pong, which have been both wildly successful, that there was a small recession in 1977, but we're fine. No problems yet. 1979, with the purchase of Atari, there was a lot of changes in management, CEO, outages, all sorts of stuff within Warner, now owning Atari. So a number of the Atari developers actually left and founded Activision, which ended up becoming the first third-party development company, which is also important because what's interesting with that is they actually had their own process for creating these cartridges, which then a lot of other developers, seeing the success of using that kind of a system, ended up also branching off, creating their own companies, and developing their own cartridges. So going into the 80s, the game market flooded with shovelware, which if you don't know what that term means, it's basically shoveling as much, the highest quantity of content out that you can without a focus on the quality of it. And a lot of it was in the same vein of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it's the same game 50 times and all 50 of them kind of suck. Which, being in 2023, I'm happy to say, the video game industry has completely learned from this lesson. It is not a problem anymore. And that is sarcasm. But also in the early 1980s, we were hit with a recession. So you can kind of see where some of these stresses and issues started to arise before the actual fall itself. But in 1982, Atari accounted for half of Warner's $2.9 billion revenue. They had a market share of 90% over the video game market itself. They had a mixed success with selling consoles between consoles they'd sell, and they would create new versions, but they had issues with backwards compatibility, which ended up kind of biting them in the butt later, as people who had already purchased consoles and cartridges and all of that weren't really interested in upgrading as soon as the industry liked to at the time. To stay competitive, Warner issued orders for a massive increase in production between all their consoles they were selling and the cartridges themselves. Because they could only sell well, obviously. They weren't meeting demand before then, so might as well push it upwards. But they did not spend enough time researching the industry, and by that time things changed. They had Mattel's Intellivision, which had been out and was already super popular, and Coleco released the ColecoVision, which, interestingly, could play Atari games on itself, which created another interesting feedback loop with their current issue of backwards compatibility. So with that, and as everything had changed, with that massive increase in production, a bunch of retailers actually started canceling the orders, leaving them with leftover stock, trying to figure out what to do with all of it. And then Atari market share now dropped 40% between all of the factors of other people coming in and the issue with order cancellations. And this would be only the beginning of the troubles for Atari. So in June of 1982, a movie you might have heard of, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, released in theaters. It was massively popular, huge success, and Atari was really interested in licensing out to make a video game. They spent about $20 to $25 million getting the license, and as negotiations went into about late July, but to ride the high of the movie, they decided it needed to be out by Christmas that same year. So they had Howard Scott Warshaw, gave him 6 weeks, and with these quotes here at the bottom, he goes, "We need an E.T. game and we need it for September 1st. Can you do it?" And I said, "You bet I can. I absolutely can." I don't know exactly what I was full of at the time. Whatever it was, I was overflowing with it, and I believed I could pull it off. I mean, the hubris of it. In interviews, he said he was given 32 hours to come up with the concept for the game. And there is a famous line in E.T. where he says, "E.T. phone home." And so Scott Warshaw said, or Howard Warshaw said, "That'll work." So the concept for the game is you are running around collecting pieces to build a phone so E.T. can phone home. And he finished it, and then Atari ordered 4 million copies of this game. And it didn't go very good. So the E.T. game sold about 2.6 million copies, but they received 3.5 million copies back of the estimated. Main issues being they ordered, or that many copies sold, however, retailers could not move the rest of the copies and also sent them back afterwards. They ended up finding out a lot of people actually buying the E.T. game were either parents or grandparents who were buying it for their kids, and were either really mad that the kids hated it, or the kids already wanted different games they liked better than the E.T. video game by the time it came out. So the game itself was a failure both in gameplay and in sales. It wasn't, the bar is impressively low for a playable video game in this day and age, and it was a playable video game, but it wasn't very good. A lot of the marketing was used to say that it was going to be a revolution, or it was going to be something brand new people had never seen before, but they were advertising it when the game had been finished a day ago. And so this GIF here at the bottom is actually some of the gameplay of the original game of you are walking around, you find an object, and then you're done. And he just kind of leaves what he was doing. So with this, at the end of 1983, Atari reported a total loss of $538 million, compared to the profit of $1.7 billion from the year before, which would have been the about half of Warner's market value. Warner stock fell from $60 to $20, And Atari, now that it was already having issues and had this massive failure, ended up getting sold or chunked off into different pieces and sold to different companies. In the end, Atari kind of survived in spirit up until the early 2000s, but basically after being traded and renamed and sold, ended up basically defunct in 1992. There is a famous urban legend that surfaced around the same time that basically all of the stock that they couldn't sell, they dug a pit in New Mexico, and they just buried it all, and then left it there to forget. So 1983 is when we start to see the massive issues arriving from the video game crash. An industry that was worth $3.2 billion in 1983 fell to $100 million by 1985. That is a 97% fall in 2 years. It wasn't completely Atari's fault. In theory, a lot of it was actually the fault of the third-party developers creating as many games as they possibly could without caring about what they were releasing. But as Atari became a face of bad quality, they ended up taking the brunt of the issues. And one of the main things also that created this is that because of the issues with Atari, which ended up branching basically to all of the developers of these cartridges that would get sent to retailers, retailers couldn't sell them and then tried to send them back. Many of the companies would actually go bankrupt or fold before the retailers could ever get their money. So retailers weren't very interested in carrying video games either, because now they didn't trust that they would actually get money back if something didn't sell, or that anybody would want it at all. And so a lot of game companies at the time ended up shutting down. There's lists of them. There's so many different developers at the time, and it's one of those where we can't even track how many we've lost. But the question becomes, well, how do we get to where we are today? In 2022, the US video game industry was worth $56.6 billion. Massive cry from the 100 million that we ended at in 1985. So, to answer this question, I'm going to step back a little bit and also take us across the ocean. In 1889, a company in Japan was founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi. They started by creating hanafuda, which is a type of Japanese playing card. They're similar to more Western traditional decks, but they're definitely smaller. As you can see, this image right up here on top is actually some of the art from the cards. Some of them are beautiful. They moved into making other types of cards into the early 1900s. In the 1950s, they actually partnered with Disney and made sets of Disney playing cards in more Western style. They expanded into board games in the 1960s into the early 1970s, but that is when they also gained an interest in moving into the video game scene. Between 1977 and 1980, the company launched a series of game consoles called Color TV Game, in Japan only. That's what they have here at the bottom. And they went international in 1979 with a new department in New York City focused on arcade games. Now this logo here, the center image is the logo. It may not mean a lot, unless you read Japanese, in which case you already know what it says. This logo might make more sense. Under the management of Shigeru Miyamoto in 1981, Nintendo Arcade Department developed a game called Donkey Kong. It was one of the first platformers that actually let you jump, and the main character was named Jumpman, aptly named. He would then go on to be called Mario. Fun fact, he's named Mario after the landlord of the New York City office. And one of my favorite facts is when they were developing Mario, they wanted to have his whole face and have the nose and mouth region, but they could not get it to work with the limited pixels they had. So they added the mustache to specifically give a differentiation between the nose and his chin. So, in 1983, the Famicom family computer launched in Japan and was super successful. With that, and to keep on to that success and seeing the issues with third-party development, Nintendo set guidelines to make sure that none of their games would appear on other consoles for a minimum of 2 years after release, and that no, they wouldn't develop more than 5 games per year. In 1983, they actually almost partnered with Atari to launch the Famicom under Atari licensing as the Nintendo Advanced Video Game System. But they may have dodged a bullet in that. And there was an issue where the ColecoVision, which was one of the competitors for the Atari, actually had Donkey Kong on it, which created a lot of legal issues trying to get them for Atari and put it into that system, which ended up dragging out the agreement to a point where Atari started crashing before they could finish it, and the deal fell through. So with that, Nintendo got the chance to sit back and see what happened during the video game crash. One of the big things is seeing what had happened. They now had a chance to either decide to release or not to release and figure out what to do to give themselves the best success. Interestingly, even though the US was suffering during this game crash and recession and everything that was happening, there was still a lot of interest in getting the arcade games into home markets. People were aware that Famicom existed in Japan and wanted to know why or figure out a way to get their own version in their own homes. The arcade games were not the only thing they developed. At the same time, they had actually created the Game & Watch, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was a little watch that you could actually play little games on, which was also super successful. But dealing with this and deciding that they still wanted to release into the US market, they came up with 4 key decisions to try to combat the issues of the video game crash. The Famicom went through a whole rebrand. It was not a video game console, it was an entertainment system. It was sophisticated, it wasn't a kid's toy, this was entertainment, interactive for the whole family. It was not a console, it was a control deck. And they were not video games, they were game packs. Very different. With that, they also implemented a lockout chip in the cartridges that they made, which meant that basically a little chip in the cartridge, when inserted into the console, could read and make sure that this was an authentic Nintendo product and that it had not been altered or hacked or messed with. Meaning that now they also had security against the third-party shovelware issues that had been plaguing them only a couple years before. They also set stricter standards for game content and for the packaging. So Nintendo was trying to market this new system towards families, not as a children's toy, but it was still for kids. So they were very strict on what content could be there to make sure that it was still child-friendly. And packaging, a major focus of this whole initiative was to make sure that the packaging of their games looked like the game. It's kind of hard to tell on here, but one of the main focuses was actually showing what the game looked like when it was being played, which was a far cry from really dramatic, bombastic video game box art that people were used to seeing. And then the final thing was the Nintendo seal of quality. Now what this meant is that they had now, with those other 3 things, were saying they were putting their own brand on the line, which was already well known because of their extent into the arcade scene. So the Nintendo seal of quality basically was them saying to both retailers and consumers that you didn't have to worry about getting a bad product because Nintendo went through the steps to make sure it was going to be good no matter what. So the question is, did it work? And I think if you've seen an NES, you can answer that question with a yes. The NES Nintendo Entertainment System launched officially September 27th, 1986. The consumer opinion being high ended up meaning that the sales were also very high. Sold 1.1 million units in 1986 and had sold 7 million by 1988. By 1990, around 30% of American households had an NES, which interestingly, butting up against the computer scene, computers around the same time were at about 23%, which had been a massive increase from a computer that cost $120,000. But while the video game console market had crashed, the computer scene got a chance to start rising, because now computers were more accessible. People could write games, share games, or anything that's not a game between each other, and this had led to a kind of a niche gap being filled as consoles had kind of been assumed to be phased out. But as we can tell, that didn't completely happen. And with the new consumer trust that paved the way for a lot of new consoles like Sega, and a few years later would be Sony with PlayStation and all sorts. Okay, and then with that was the video game crash marked the end of the second generation of console. And with NES started the third. And from there on, we have the fourth, fifth, etc., till today. So in theory, the rest is history. Except for one more thing. What about the pit in New Mexico? So, in 2014, Microsoft, Fuel Industries, and others partnered with the New Mexico government to figure out that answer. They had news reports and personal reports from 1983 saying there was like 14 truckloads of consoles and cartridges that were taken and dumped in a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and then buried under a layer of concrete to make sure nobody could get in them. And then, April 26, 2014, they found the burial site in a landfill under a layer of concrete. They were able to speak with Atari officials and found there were 700,000 cartridges that had been sent. So a far cry from the millions, that is still quite a few. About 1,300 were recovered, including ET specifically, but it also had like an Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, actual Atari 2600s, all sorts of things were found. Most of them were either curated or auctioned off to gain money to build museums and exhibits to commemorate this. The project in 2014 was actually founded for this Atari Game Over documentary, so that they could actually, it's super interesting, goes over kind of the history of Atari and then leads into this burial site. So at the end, I think it's very interesting to see how one company with 90% market share can drop to nothing in a matter of years. And this quote from Hiroshi Yamauchi, I think, is very interesting. He was actually the president during the production of the NES all the way up until 2002. So he saw NES, SNES, 64, Game Boy Color, GameCube, and he said, the gaming wars, they will never end. That's just how the business works. Nobody knows what tomorrow will bring.
Questions if anybody needs to know more.